A cold Tuesday in April 1958, Omaha, Nebraska. He fired 6 shots at his mother and waited patiently. He wasn't done. Seconds later, his father pushes the door open and sees his wife on the ground, his 16-year-old son standing over her with a smoking. Shock, anger, rage all at once, and he launches towards his son. But the boy had it all planned out. Another 6 shots at his own father. He probably died by the third or fourth bullet, but he had to empty his shells to ensure there was no mistakes. He drags them to the basement of their home and drives off with the family car to pick his girlfriend for a movie date. How he managed to keep his composure throughout the show, we will never know, but he did. And then he vanished for 53 years. But in 2022, a single DNA match revealed the truth. America's most brazen fugitive had been hiding in plain sight. The email notification appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in 2022, unremarkable in its arrival. Just another automated message from Ancestry.com, the kind that millions of users receive daily when the algorithm finds a genetic connection in its vast database. But this particular match would crack open a mystery that had frustrated investigators for more than half a century. The man who opened that email believed his father had been an orphan from Chicago. John Damon had always been vague about his past, offering only fragments when pressed, a childhood lost to the foster system, records destroyed in a fire, no living relatives to speak of. It seemed tragic, but not impossible. America had plenty of lost souls reinventing themselves in the latter half of the 20th century. What the son didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 12 years earlier, when his father had died peacefully of natural causes in 2010, he'd taken one of the most brazen secrets in American criminal history to his grave. The quiet businessman who loved music and preached about always doing your best had another name, another life, another story entirely. Somewhere in an office in Arlington, Virginia, a U.S. Marshals computer system registered the same match. After decades of dead ends, false sightings, and frustrating silence, a piece of genetic code had finally spoken. The ghost they'd been chasing since 1967 had materialized in the most unexpected way possible. Leslie Arnold's 53-year disappearance was about to end, but to understand how a teenage killer could vanish so completely, to grasp the audacity of his reinvention, we need to go back to where it all began. To a September afternoon in Omaha, Nebraska, when the all-American boy next door became a double murderer over something as simple as borrowing the car keys. Omaha, 1958 existed in a peculiar moment between wars and cultural upheaval. Eisenhower occupied the White House. Elvis scandalized parents from coast to coast. Families gathered around black and white television sets, and teenagers cruised main streets in chrome-laden automobiles that guzzled gasoline like it would never run out. In middle-class neighborhoods across the country, manicured lawns stretched behind white picket fences, and the future seemed to promise nothing but prosperity and peace. Omaha, Nebraska embodied this post-war optimism. The city hummed with the commerce of the heartland. Stockyards and insurance companies, railroads and grain elevators. Tree-lined streets bore witness to the daily rhythms of ordinary American life. Men commuted to downtown offices in dark suits and fedoras. Women managed households and raised children according to Dr. Spock's reassuring advice. Teenagers attended sock hops and football games, their lives structured by school bells and curfews. The Arnold family fit seamlessly into this tableau. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. Bill Arnold ran a modest business, providing enough income to keep his family comfortable in their home on the city's north side. His wife, Opal, maintained the household with the quiet efficiency expected of women in that era. Their 2 sons represented the future, Leslie, 16, and Jimmy, 13, growing up in the security of suburban normalcy. From the outside, nothing distinguished the Arnolds from thousands of other families in thousands of other neighborhoods across America. The house needed paint in places. The lawn grew thick in summer and buried itself under snow in winter. The car in the driveway was a few years old, but reliable. Everything appeared perfectly, unremarkably ordinary. But inside those walls, something was growing that the neighbors couldn't see. Leslie, the boy in the band at 16, Leslie Arnold presented exactly the image you'd expect from a teenager in late 1950s Omaha. He showed up to Lincoln High School on time most mornings, his hair neatly combed, his clothes pressed and tucked. Teachers marked him down as a solid student. Not brilliant, but capable, turning in assignments with reasonable consistency. He caused no trouble, drew no special attention, blended into the sea of adolescent faces that filled the hallways between classes. Music provided his one distinguishing feature. Leslie played saxophone in the school band, his fingers dancing across the keys during football halftime shows and spring concerts. There's something about the saxophone that captures a particular kind of mid-century American masculinity. Cool without being rebellious, artistic without being effeminate. The instrument suited him. He practiced regularly, his bedroom echoing with scales and jazz standards that drifted through the house on weekday evenings. His younger brother Jimmy looked up to him the way younger brothers often do. They shared the bathroom, fought over whose turn it was to take out the trash, and maintained the complex alliance that exists between siblings born 3 years apart. Jimmy was still in junior high, navigating the treacherous waters of early adolescence, while Leslie had advanced to the relative sophistication of high school. But if you looked closer, and this is something we can only see in hindsight through the distorting lens of what came later, there were hairline fractures in the facade. Leslie had been dating a girl for several months, and his mother disapproved. In an era when parents still wielded considerable authority over their children's social lives, Opal Arnold had made her feelings clear. She didn't like the girl, didn't approve of how much time Leslie spent with her, didn't want the relationship to continue. We don't know the girl's name. She disappears from the historical record almost immediately, identified in newspaper accounts only as the girlfriend. Perhaps she was from the wrong side of town. Perhaps her family had a reputation. Perhaps Opal simply felt that Leslie, at 16, was too young for such serious attachment. Whatever her reasons, she'd drawn a line, and that line had become a source of escalating tension. The phone in the Arnold household was a rotary model mounted on the kitchen wall, its cord stretching only so far before pulling taut. On school nights and weekends, that phone became a battleground. Leslie would settle in for long conversations with his girlfriend, his voice dropping to a murmur, his body language defensive when his mother walked past. Opal would glance at the clock, her jaw tightening, calculating how long the line had been tied up. In hindsight, we construct narratives that make sense of senseless acts. We search for warning signs, red flags, moments when intervention might have changed everything. But the truth is that thousands of teenagers fought with their mothers over girlfriends in 1958. Thousands of parents disapproved of their children's romantic choices. The overwhelming majority of those conflicts resolved themselves through nothing more dramatic than slammed doors, sullen silences, and the gradual erosion of parental control as children aged into independence. The Arnold's conflict should have been equally mundane, should have been nothing more than a footnote in the family history, a story told at future gatherings with rueful laughter. Remember when your mother hated that girl you dated in high school? But September 27th, 1958 was a Saturday. And on that particular afternoon, something in Leslie Arnold snapped. Saturday, September 27th, 1958 morning arrived with the comfortable laziness of a weekend. No school bells. No rigid schedule. Jimmy had plans to work as an usher at the rodeo, a chance to earn some pocket money and escape the house for the afternoon. Bill Arnold had business to attend to. Opal faced the familiar rituals of maintaining a household. Laundry to fold, meals to prepare, the endless domestic tasks that filled the days of women in that era. And Leslie wanted to borrow the car. The request itself was unremarkable. Teenagers across America negotiated for car privileges with the desperation of refugees seeking passage to freedom. The automobile represented independence, mobility, the ability to escape parental supervision, even if only for a few hours. Drive-in movies were particularly prized destinations. Dark spaces where young couples could claim temporary privacy under the guise of watching whatever film was playing on a massive outdoor screen. The Undead was showing at the local drive-in that Saturday night. A low-budget horror film about a woman sent back through time to medieval times where she's accused of witchcraft. The kind of B-movie that provided perfect background noise for necking in the back seat. Leslie wanted to take his girlfriend. He needed the car. And the afternoon devolved into the argument that had been building for weeks. The exact sequence of words is lost to history. We know the positions each person held. Opal's disapproval, Leslie's frustration, the toxic mixture of teenage desire and parental authority. We know the argument stretched across hours, voices rising and falling, the temperature in the house climbing with the accumulated resentment of months. The phone rang at some point. Or perhaps Leslie made the call. Either way, he ended up tying up the line again, his mother's irritation visible in her tightening shoulders, her sharp glances toward the kitchen. When he finally hung up around mid-afternoon, the conflict reignited with fresh intensity. Imagine the scene from Opal's perspective, her 16-year-old son defying her authority, determined to see this girl she'd forbidden him to pursue, acting as if her opinions and rules meant nothing. In 1958, parental authority was supposed to mean something. Children were expected to obey. The breakdown of that order must have felt like a personal failure, a crack in the foundation of family structure. Now imagine it from Leslie's point of view. The suffocating control, the unreasonable prohibition against someone who mattered to him, the fundamental unfairness of being old enough to feel adult emotions, but young enough to be treated like a child. Every teenager believes their parents don't understand. Most are wrong. But the intensity of that conviction, the absolute certainty that the adult world is conspiring to crush something precious and real, that feeling is nearly universal. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Leslie came downstairs. The house was quiet. Jimmy had already left for the rodeo. Bill Arnold was out. It was just mother and son, the argument hanging in the air like smoke. "Can I borrow the car?" Leslie asked. The answer was no. Not just for today, but implied in that refusal was the larger prohibition. No to the girl. No to the drive-in. No to the independence Leslie craved. Just know what happens in a human brain when something breaks. Psychologists talk about snap decisions, rage responses, the momentary disconnect between impulse and consequence. But those clinical terms don't capture the immediacy of what happened next. Don't explain how a teenage boy who played saxophone in the school band could cross the line from angry son to murderer in the span of heartbeats. Leslie went to where the family kept their rifle. The weapon was probably a .22 caliber, common in American households, used for hunting small game or target practice. Not an unusual item to find in a Nebraska home in 1958. He picked it up, loaded it, and walked back to where his mother stood. The first shot punched through the afternoon quiet like thunder. Then the second, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. 6 bullets, 6 pulls of the trigger, 6 impacts driving through flesh and bone. Opal Arnold didn't have time to scream, to run, to process what her son was doing. The attack lasted perhaps 10 seconds from first shot to last. She collapsed in the dining room, her body coming to rest on the floor where the family gathered for meals. Blood spread across the linoleum in patterns that would haunt the crime scene investigators who arrived 2 weeks later. 6 shots directly to the heart region. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a warning gone wrong. This was execution. And Leslie stood over her body, the rifle still warm in his hands, and waited. Bill Arnold had no warning. Whatever business had taken him away from the house that afternoon concluded in the normal way. Perhaps he picked up supplies. Perhaps he made sales calls. Perhaps he simply ran errands. The details are lost. What matters is that he came home to find his 16-year-old son standing in the dining room and his wife's body on the floor. The shock must have been absolute. The human mind needs time to process trauma, to reconcile the impossible scene with reality. Bill Arnold didn't get that time. According to Leslie's later confession, his father saw Opal lying there and lunged toward his son. Whether he meant to attack, to disarm, to somehow stop what had already happened, we'll never know. Leslie fired again. 6 more shots, matching the 6 that had killed his mother. Bill Arnold's body crumpled in the same room where his wife had fallen minutes earlier. The life they'd built together, The modest business, the two sons, the ordinary struggles and small triumphs of middle-class existence ended in a dining room splattered with blood and gunpowder residue, .16 shells. Two parents. One afternoon. And Leslie Arnold still had a date to keep out. Here's where the story shifts from spontaneous violence to calculated action. Rage might explain the murders themselves, a moment of catastrophic loss of control, however inexcusable. But what came next reveals something colder, more methodical in Leslie Arnold's makeup, that he didn't panic, didn't break down, didn't call the police in a fit of guilt and horror. Instead, he began to clean up. First, he dragged both bodies down to the basement. Picture the physical effort required. His father's weight, his mother's dead weight, the awkward navigation of stairs and doorways. Blood left trails that needed to be addressed. Leslie found cleaning supplies, a mop, whatever was available. He worked methodically to remove the visible evidence from the dining room floor, reducing his parents' deaths to stains that needed scrubbing. The basement became a temporary morgue. Two bodies on the concrete floor, growing cold while their teenage son finished erasing the crime scene upstairs. How long did this take? An hour? 2. The sun was still up. Jimmy would need to be collected from the rodeo. And Leslie had plans for the evening that he drove to the rodeo venue, his hands steady on the wheel. Found his 13-year-old brother among the crowds and concession stands. Jimmy climbed into the car, probably thinking about what he'd seen that afternoon. The bulls, the riders, the excitement of the event. Mom and Dad had to leave town, Leslie told him. Some family emergency, something sudden that couldn't wait. The lie came smoothly, requiring no visible effort. You're staying with the neighbors tonight. Jimmy had no reason to doubt his older brother. Parents did travel. Emergencies did happen. He probably nodded, asked a few questions that Leslie fielded with continued calm, and accepted the story at face value. Children generally trust that adults are handling adult matters appropriately. Leslie dropped his brother at a neighbor's house, explaining the situation with the same unruffled composure. Then he picked up his girlfriend and drove to the drive-in movie theater. The undead flickered across the enormous screen while couples parked in careful rows, speakers hanging from partially rolled-down windows. Whether Leslie watched the movie or spent the time focused on his date, we don't know. But he went through with it. The evening he'd killed his parents to make possible. The bodies waited in the basement. The blood had been mopped. The lie had been told. And Leslie Arnold sat in the darkness of the drive-in theater, 2 hours removed from double murder, acting as if nothing had changed. Morning services at the family church began at the usual hour. Leslie Arnold attended, his girlfriend beside him, her parents nearby. He wore his Sunday clothes, carried a Bible or hymnal, sang from the same songbook everyone else shared. The congregation rose and sat according to familiar patterns, responsive readings and prayers following the liturgical rhythm that structured the week. Did anyone notice anything different about the teenage boy in their midst? Did his face betray the events of the previous afternoon? By all accounts, no. He appeared perfectly normal, a young man worshiping with his girlfriend's family, participating in the rituals that millions of Americans observed every Sunday. The sermon preached that morning is lost to history. Perhaps it touched on forgiveness, community, the fundamental commandments that included, "Thou shalt not kill." Perhaps Leslie sat through references to honoring thy father and mother without flinching. Or perhaps the message was something entirely different, some element of scripture that had nothing to do with the crimes he'd committed just hours earlier. After the service concluded, as the congregation filtered out into the autumn sunshine, exchanging pleasantries and making plans for the week ahead, Leslie shook hands and smiled and gave no indication that two bodies were decomposing in his family's basement. Later that Sunday, Leslie approached a neighbor with a simple request. Could he borrow a shovel? Just for some gardening work? Nothing urgent. The neighbor agreed without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? Leslie was a good kid from a respectable family. If he wanted to do some yard work, that seemed admirable. The backyard of the Arnold home featured a lilac bush near the fence. Common landscaping for the era, the kind of ornamental shrub that appeared in thousands of American yards. The purple flowers would have finished blooming months earlier, the bush now preparing for winter dormancy. Beneath it, The soil was probably reasonably soft, not yet frozen by the harsher weather that would arrive in the coming months. Leslie began to dig. 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, approximately 3 feet deep. The dimensions were specific, calculated to accommodate 2 adult bodies laid side by side. This wasn't frantic digging, wasn't the desperate excavation of someone trying to hide evidence before getting caught. This was systematic labor, probably taking several hours to complete properly. Did neighbors notice? Perhaps they glanced over fences, saw a teenage boy doing yard work, and thought nothing of it. Adolescents were often assigned outdoor chores. The sight was utterly unremarkable. No reason to pay closer attention, no cause for concern. The trench complete, Leslie waited for darkness. Daylight made the next phase too risky. But once the sun set and the neighborhood settled into evening routines, families gathered around television sets, children put to bed, streetlights casting their inadequate glow, he could move the bodies without observation. Down from the basement they came, one at a time or together, we don't know. Bill Arnold's body, Opal Arnold's body, carried or dragged across the yard to their final resting place. Leslie arranged them in a shallow grave he'd prepared, then covered them with a wooden board. Not buried yet, just concealed beneath a flat surface that would support a covering of dirt. Then he shoveled the excavated soil back into place, patting it down, smoothing it out, transforming the grave into what might pass for recent gardening work. The lilac bush stood sentinel over the spot where William and Opal Arnold would remain hidden for the next 2 weeks. Monday morning, Leslie opened his father's business. He greeted the salesman with the same story he'd told everyone else. Bill had to leave town unexpectedly. Family emergency. They were on their own for a while. The men probably shrugged and went about their day. Business owners traveled. Situations arose. They'd manage until the boss returned. Leslie arrived late to school that day, but he had a ready explanation. Doctor's appointment. The attendant's office marked him down without suspicion. Teenagers missed first period sometimes. Life happened, and so began a 2-week performance that required constant maintenance. Every interaction carried the risk of exposure. Every question about his parents demanded a consistent answer. Leslie couldn't afford to change his story, couldn't let his guard down, couldn't show the strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception. Where are your parents? Out of town. Family emergency. When will they be back? Not sure. Depends on how things go. Shouldn't you be with them? They wanted me to stay, keep things running here, take care of my brother. The lies multiplied naturally, each one supporting the others, building into a structure that seemed solid enough to stand scrutiny. And for nearly 2 weeks, it worked. Leslie went to school, attended band practice, ran his father's business, maintained all the normal rhythms of teenage life while his parents' bodies decomposed beneath the lilac bush. Jimmy stayed with neighbors, his older brother explaining that their parents would be back soon. Everything was fine. No need to worry. The 13-year-old accepted this explanation because children generally trust that adults know what they're doing. And Leslie, at 16, must have seemed adult enough to handle the situation. But deceptions have structural limits. The longer they persist, the more pressure they face from accumulating questions. Bill Arnold's business contacts would eventually need real answers. Opal Arnold's friends would want to know specifics. Family members would grow concerned about the extended absence. And the neighbors caring for Jimmy couldn't be expected to continue indefinitely without more information. 10 days into the lie, Leslie's luck began fracturing. Bill Arnold's parents made the trip to Omaha, concern sharpening into alarm. They'd heard nothing from their son or daughter-in-law for more than a week. Phone calls went unanswered or resulted in Leslie's evasive responses. Something felt wrong. Parental instinct overrode the desire to respect their adult son's privacy and autonomy. They went to the neighbor's house first, where Jimmy had been staying. The boy was healthy, well-fed, seemingly unbothered by his parents' absence. But that didn't ease the grandparents' worry. Where were Bill and Opal? Why hadn't they called? Why had they left the boys like this? The grandparents debated calling the police. The conversation probably went in circles. Maybe there was a legitimate explanation. Maybe they were overreacting. Maybe their son would walk through the door any minute and be irritated by their interference. But as the hours passed without resolution, The justifications for inaction grew thinner. Finally, a great uncle picked up the phone and called the authorities. Not an emergency call, not a report of bodies or violence, just a welfare check request tinged with familial anxiety. "Something's off," he told the dispatcher. "The parents have been gone for 2 weeks, and Leslie might know more than he's saying." The words hung in the air. Leslie might know something. Detectives brought the 16-year-old in for questioning. Picture the interrogation room. Institutional walls, harsh lighting, a table, a few chairs, the weight of adult authority bearing down on a teenager who'd been maintaining an impossible fiction for 14 days that we don't know exactly what was said, what techniques the investigators employed, how long the conversation lasted before Leslie's resistance collapsed. But at some point during that interrogation, the story he'd been telling evaporated. The fiction he'd maintained through sheer force of will couldn't survive sustained professional scrutiny. Leslie confessed to everything. The argument, the rifle, the 6 shots to his mother's heart, his father's return, and the 6 more bullets that killed him. The basement, the cleanup, the grave. Where? The detectives asked. The backyard, Leslie told them. Under the lilac bush. News travels fast in tight-knit communities, especially when it involves violence in places that consider themselves safe from such darkness. By the time detectives arrived at the Arnold home with shovels and crime scene equipment, neighbors had begun lining the street. They stood on porches, gathered in small clusters on sidewalks, pressed against the boundaries of the property like spectators at some horrible public event. These were people who'd lived beside the Arnolds for years, who'd waved at Bill on his way to work, who'd exchanged pleasantries with Opal at the grocery store, who'd watched Leslie and Jimmy grow from children into young men. The revelation of what had happened inside that ordinary house, beneath that ordinary lilac bush, shattered every assumption about safety and normalcy. The crowd watched in silence as detectives marked off the area. Someone photographed the scene, grainy black and white images that would later appear in newspapers, the kind of crime scene documentation that looks primitive by modern standards but captured the essential horror. The lilac bush, the disturbed earth, the officers preparing to dig. Approximately 1 foot down, a shovel struck something that wasn't soil. Bill Arnold's wrist, the watch still strapped around it, frozen at whatever time he'd last wound it before coming home to die. The chronometer had continued ticking for some period after his death. We don't know how long. Before the mechanism finally ran down beneath 3 feet of earth. They excavated carefully now, documenting every detail. Opal's body emerged first, positioned on top of her husband's. Her legs had been bound together with a belt, whether to make moving the body easier or for some other reason. Only Leslie could say. She still wore her watch and jewelry. The person who'd killed her hadn't bothered robbing her. This wasn't a crime of profit. Her purse turned up later under the floor mat of the family car. Another detail that investigators would catalog and preserve, though it added little to understanding why a 16-year-old boy had murdered his parents over permission to borrow that same vehicle. Bill Arnold's body lay beneath his wife's. The 2 people who'd created Leslie, raised him, provided for him, disciplined him, loved him in whatever imperfect ways parents manage. They'd been stacked like cordwood in a shallow grave and covered with a wooden board that turned the earth above them into a temporary floor. The autopsies would later confirm what Leslie had already confessed: 6 bullets to Opal's chest, 6 to Bill's. Tight groupings suggesting either calm aim or close-range firing that didn't require precision. Cause of death never in question. The coroner's reports filled with clinical language that reduced human lives to measurements and observations. Weight, height, wound patterns, estimated time of death. But in that moment, as detectives carefully exhumed the bodies while neighbors watched from behind police lines, the horror wasn't clinical. It was personal. These are people the community hadn't known. And the boy who'd killed them, handcuffed now, standing between 2 officers who'd made him point out the grave site, was someone they'd known too. Leslie Arnold's trial was never going to be dramatic. He'd confessed immediately, shown them where he'd buried the bodies, provided every detail the prosecution needed. His defense attorney faced an impossible situation. A 16-year-old client who'd committed patricide and matricide showed no remorse, and had no credible argument for innocence. The decision to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder was strategic. First-degree murder required premeditation, planning, forethought, evidence that the killer had considered and intended the crime before committing it. Second-degree murder allowed for the possibility that Leslie had acted impulsively, that the rage had overcome him in a moment, that despite the careful cleanup and calculated deception afterward, the initial violence hadn't been planned. It was a legal distinction that mattered for sentencing. Nebraska had the death penalty in 1958, but executing a 16-year-old, even one guilty of killing his parents, carried political and moral complications that prosecutors might have preferred to avoid. Second-degree murder offered life imprisonment as an alternative. The plea hearing would have been brief. The judge reviewed the charges, confirmed that Leslie understood what he was pleading guilty to, verified that he was making this decision voluntarily and not under coercion. The prosecution presented evidence establishing the facts of the case: the bodies, the ballistics, the confession. Leslie's attorney offered whatever mitigating circumstances could be mustered: his age, the troubled family dynamics, the possibility of rehabilitation. But ultimately, the judge had limited discretion. 2 people were dead by Leslie Arnold's hand. He'd admitted it. The sentence was life in prison. Just 16 years old, Leslie Arnold became inmate number 16243 at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. He would never vote, never own a gun legally, never escape the label of convicted killer. His future had narrowed to the confines of a cell, his remaining decades mapped out in the rigid routine of institutional life. Except Leslie Arnold had other plans. The Nebraska State Penitentiary in the 1960s was a fortress of brick and steel designed to contain men society had deemed too dangerous for freedom. Its walls rose thick and high, topped with guard towers and searchlights. The yards were bare exercise spaces surrounded by chain-link fences and razor wire. Inside, concrete and metal comprised most surfaces, hard, cold, resistant to damage or escape attempts. Into this environment came a 16-year-old boy who'd killed his parents. Prison culture has its own hierarchies and codes. Men who harm children occupy the lowest tier, subject to violence from other inmates. But patricide and matricide exist in a strange category, shocking enough to generate notoriety, but not quite triggering the same tribal response as child predators or rapists. Leslie kept his head down. He worked in the prison print shop, learning the trade skills that correctional facilities emphasized as part of rehabilitation. The repetitive work, setting type, running presses, binding documents provided structure to his days. He drew a paycheck in prison script, accumulated privileges, and demonstrated that he could follow rules when he chose to. He also continued playing saxophone. The prison band needed members, and Leslie's high school experience qualified him. Music echoed through the prison during practices and occasional performances, offering both players and audience a temporary escape from their surroundings. Leslie's fingers moved across the keys, producing melodies that seemed at odds with his surroundings and his crimes. That he joined the Junior Chamber, JC's, prison chapter, a civic organization that operated inside the facility, giving inmates opportunities to organize events, develop leadership skills, and maintain connections to the outside world's social structures. Participation looked good in parole hearings, demonstrated investment in self-improvement, suggested that rehabilitation was possible. On Christmas, Leslie even volunteered at the governor's mansion, a privilege extended to select inmates with demonstrated good behavior. The irony was sharp. A boy who'd murdered his own parents serving dinner to Nebraska's first family, trusted enough to be outside the prison walls, even if briefly and under supervision. The casual observer, Leslie Arnold appeared to be exactly what the prison system hoped to create: a rehabilitated offender, remorseful for his crimes, engaged in productive work and positive activities, earning his way toward eventual reintegration into society. But that observer would have been wrong. By 1967, Leslie Arnold had served 9 years. He was 24 years old now, no longer the teenage boy who'd been sentenced, but a young man who'd spent his entire adult life behind bars. He knew the prison's rhythms, understood its security protocols, recognized its weaknesses. The fence surrounding the prison yard stood 12 feet tall, imposing but not insurmountable. Guards patrolled on predictable schedules. Lighting created shadows. And on the night of July 14th, 1967, just before midnight, Leslie Arnold and another inmate made their move. Scaling a 12-foot fence requires strength, coordination, and motivation. The chain link provides handholds and footholds, but the climb remains precarious. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the attempt fails. Guards notice. Alarms sound. The escape ends before it begins. But on this particular night, both men made it over. Dropped down on the other side in a freedom so sudden it must have felt surreal. Then they ran, splitting up to maximize their chances, disappearing into the Omaha night while prison officials were still processing the fact that the escape had succeeded. The warden's response was immediate and comprehensive. Roadblocks materialized on highways leading out of the city. Police departments across Nebraska received alerts with physical descriptions. The FBI got involved, as federal agencies do when fugitives cross state lines. The manhunt deployed every resource available, predicated on the assumption that the fugitives were still somewhere in the region, trying desperately to get as far away as possible before the net closed. The warden later called it the cleanest escape he'd ever witnessed. After that night, the Nebraska State Penitentiary tightened its security protocols so dramatically that no one ever managed to breach them again. New fencing, additional guards, modified procedures. The successful escape became the catalyst for systemic changes designed to ensure it could never happen again. Leslie Arnold's fellow escapee was recaptured within a year, caught in another state, returned to Nebraska, his brief taste of freedom ending in additional charges and extended sentence. But Leslie himself vanished as thoroughly as if the earth had swallowed him whole. In no sightings that led anywhere. No arrests under his name or matching his description. No paper trail of social security numbers, driver's licenses, utility bills, or employment records. He didn't contact family members or former friends. Didn't make mistakes that would flag his identity. Simply ceased to exist in any official or traceable capacity. For investigators working the case, it was maddening. Someone had to have seen him. Someone had to know where he'd gone. People don't just disappear. They leave traces, jobs, addresses, relationships, financial transactions. Modern surveillance states make anonymity nearly impossible. But in 1967, before computers networked every database, before credit cards tracked every purchase, before security cameras recorded every public space, it was possible, barely, improbably possible for someone to slip between the cracks and vanish. The case went cold. Years became decades. Investigators retired, died, or moved on to more current crises. The file on Leslie Arnold gathered dust in archives, updated occasionally when someone thought they had a lead, but inevitably returning to inactive status when a lead evaporated. Leslie Arnold became one of the longest-running unsolved prison escapes in American history. A ghost story, a reminder of the one that got away. A name on a list of fugitives who might be dead or might be out there somewhere, living under an assumed identity, laughing at the authorities who'd lost him. And he was out there, building an entirely new existence. Becoming someone else so completely that everyone who knew him believed the fiction was reality. To T some point between scaling that prison fence in Nebraska and establishing himself under a new identity. Leslie Arnold ceased to exist, and John Damon was born. The mechanics of this transformation remain partially mysterious. How did he obtain new documents? Who helped him? Or did he manage it alone? The answers died with him, though we know that John Damon claimed to be from Chicago. That he said he was an orphan, raised in foster care, his records lost in a fire. A backstory that explained why he had no family connections, no childhood photos, no old friends who might contradict his story. It was simple enough to be credible, tragic enough to discourage detailed questions, and flexible enough to evolve as needed. Chicago was large enough that claiming it as a hometown didn't invite many follow-up questions. Orphanages and foster care systems were chaotic enough that missing records seemed plausible. In America in the 1970s and 1980s was still a place where you could reinvent yourself if you were careful, determined, and willing to permanently sever all connections to your past. Leslie, now John, moved frequently. Chicago, California, Ohio, Florida, never staying long enough to develop deep roots, always keeping relationships somewhat superficial, maintaining the restlessness of someone who couldn't afford to be pinned down. He worked legitimate jobs, paying taxes and contributing to Social Security under his assumed name. The system accepted him because he gave it no reason not to. He obtained a passport, which suggests either sophisticated forgery or a remarkable exploitation of bureaucratic gaps. International travel requires documentation that theoretically should be difficult for someone living under a false identity to acquire. But John Damon traveled, left the country, entered other nations, returned to the United States without triggering alarms. Eventually, his wandering took him even further, New Zealand first, then Australia. English-speaking countries with strong ties to America, but geographic distance that made verification of his backstory even more difficult. By the time he settled in Australia, John Damon had been his identity longer than Leslie Arnold ever was. Australia became home in a way no other place had. John Damon established himself as a businessman. Nothing flashy, nothing that attracted attention, but legitimate enough to support himself and eventually a family. He had that musician's soul still. The saxophone he'd learned to play in an Omaha high school remained part of his identity. Music studios or teaching, perhaps. The records don't specify exactly what business ventures occupied him, but they generated enough income to live comfortably that he married. Not once, but twice over the decades. The first marriage presumably ended in divorce, though details remain private. The second marriage lasted until his death, his wife believing she knew everything important about the man sharing her life. Children came, 2 biological children of his own and 3 stepchildren from a second marriage. He played the role of father and stepfather, attending school events, offering guidance, providing financially. His children would later describe him as devoted, hardworking, someone who valued education and personal growth. Always be your best was advice he apparently repeated often. The Nebraska State Penitentiary's escape remained on the books as successfully executed, the one breach in their security that had never been rectified by recapture. But at least now they knew what happened to the inmate who'd climbed their fence in 1967. Bill and Opal Arnold's murders technically remained solved. Leslie had been convicted before his escape. But there was a certain closure in knowing that their killer had lived an ordinary life far from Nebraska, that he'd ultimately died of natural causes rather than violence, that his deception had been so complete it took genetic science to penetrate it. Jimmy Arnold, the brother who'd been at the rodeo when his parents were murdered, who'd been lied to by his older sibling, who'd cooperated with authorities for decades. He finally had answers, too. His brother hadn't died in 1967, hadn't suffered some unknown fate, had instead lived a full life under an assumed identity, started a new family, and successfully evaded capture until natural causes ended his run. How does someone commit patricide and matricide at 16 and then become a devoted father? What psychological mechanisms allow such dramatic transformation? Or was there no transformation at all, just careful performance? A lifetime of acting the role of normal human being while suppressing whatever darkness enabled the original crimes. Psychologists who study criminals who successfully integrate into society after violent acts note that age matters. 16-year-old brains aren't fully developed, particularly in regions governing impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. The Leslie Arnold who killed his parents was, neurologically speaking, different from the adult man he would become. Time and maturity can produce genuine change in ways that seem impossible immediately after crime. But this explanation doesn't fully satisfy. Plenty of 16-year-olds commit terrible acts and never develop the capacity for normal relationships. And genuine rehabilitation usually involves confronting what you've done, processing guilt and remorse, accepting responsibility. John Damon never did any of that. He buried Leslie Arnold and moved on, building a life that required permanent denial of past actions. Perhaps the secret is simpler. Human beings contain multitudes. We're capable of both terrible violence and genuine love. The same hands that pulled a trigger can later cradle an infant. The same mind that planned murder can later counsel children about integrity. We want people to be consistent, to have core identities that remain stable. But perhaps we're more fragmented than we'd like to admit, more capable of compartmentalizing, more able to be different people in different contexts. John Damon's family faced a terrible choice after learning the truth: remain silent and protect their father's memory, or cooperate with authorities and allow the story to become public. They chose transparency, worked with investigators, acknowledged the reality even as they processed their own grief and shock. But was that the right choice? John Damon was dead. He couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't serve additional time, couldn't answer for his escape or his decades of deception. Revealing his true identity hurt his family while providing no additional justice for victims who'd been dead for more than 60 years. On the other hand, truth matters. Bill and Opal Arnold's relatives deserve to know what happened to their killer. The public deserved to understand that one of the longest-running fugitive cases in American history had been solved. And perhaps most importantly, the integrity of identity itself demands acknowledgement. You can't just erase someone and create a new person to replace them. One thing seems certain. What Leslie Arnold accomplished in 1967 would be nearly impossible today. Every aspect of modern life generates digital traces. Security cameras capture our movements. Biometric identification, fingerprints, facial recognition, iris scans, makes assumption of false identity incredibly difficult. Banking requires social security numbers verified through multiple databases. Employment background checks dig into history. International travel involves sophisticated document verification. The gaps in bureaucracy that existed in the late 1960s and 1970s have largely closed. Not completely. People still disappear, identities still get stolen or fabricated, but the degree of anonymity available then simply doesn't exist now. Leslie Arnold succeeded partly through careful planning, partly through luck, and partly because the surveillance infrastructure that would make such disappearance nearly impossible hadn't yet been built. Genetic genealogy represents the final nail in the coffin for fugitives hoping to vanish. You can change your name, alter your appearance, move to another country. But your DNA remains constant, and your relatives have DNA that marks you as family. The expanding databases of genetic information create webs of connection that grow harder to escape with each passing year. Cold cases that frustrated investigators for decades are being solved by algorithms comparing genetic markers across populations that, in the end, we're left with competing legacies. Leslie Arnold, the teenage killer. John Damon, the devoted father. The same person, the same consciousness, the same physical body moving through time from one identity to the other. His children carry both legacies now. They didn't choose this knowledge, didn't ask to discover that their family history contains such darkness. But they're navigating it with a grace that suggests their father's advice about being your best wasn't hollow performance. Whatever else John Damon was, he appears to have been a genuinely positive presence in his children's lives. The irony cuts deep. A man who'd murdered his own parents became a father himself. Did he think about Bill and Opal when he looked at his children? Did he feel the weight of that contradiction? Or had John Damon's personality developed so completely that Leslie Arnold's crimes felt like something that had happened to someone else? His son would eventually tell reporters, "I remember the dad who worked hard, who loved music, who taught me to always be my best." That's the legacy John Damon built. A positive presence in his children's lives, stable and reliable in ways that contrasted dramatically with the violent teenager who'd killed over car keys, family gatherings, birthdays, holidays. The ordinary milestones of domestic life accumulated. John Damon participated in all of them, his secret locked away so completely that the people closest to him had no inkling. He must have been careful about certain topics, avoided detailed questions about his childhood, deflected invitations to visit non-existent family back in America, maintained a fiction of having no living relatives, even as his own children grew up surrounded by their mother's extended family. But lies of this magnitude require constant vigilance. One slip, one moment of forgetting which story he'd told, and the entire construction could collapse. For more than 40 years, John Damon maintained perfect discipline, never contacted anyone from his past, never allowed nostalgia or curiosity to override caution, never broke character even slightly. In 2010, he died of natural causes. Perhaps cancer, perhaps heart disease, perhaps simply the accumulated wear of decades. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that John Damon died peacefully, surrounded by family who mourned him, believing they'd lost a good man who'd had a difficult start in life, but had overcome it to build something worthwhile. He was buried, or cremated, the records don't say, with full recognition of the life he'd lived as John Damon. Obituaries listed his survivors, probably mentioned his business accomplishments, noted his love of music. Friends attended whatever services marked his passing, sharing memories of the man they'd known. And Leslie Arnold remained dead and buried in 1967, a name filed away in unsolved case folders, occasionally mentioned in articles about spectacular prison escapes, but functionally forgotten except by a few aging investigators who'd worked the case and the family members left behind when he vanished. For 12 more years, both men stayed buried. Leslie in official files, John in whatever cemetery or memorial garden held his remains. Then in 2022, the Sun decided to explore his ancestry. The rise of consumer genetic testing transformed genealogy from a hobby requiring dusty archives and cemetery visits into something anyone could do with a cheek swab and a credit card. Companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe built massive databases by convincing millions of people to submit their DNA in exchange for information about ethnic background, health predispositions, and family connections. The science is elegant in its simplicity. Human DNA contains markers passed down through generations, creating patterns that allow identification of relatives even without knowing their names. Submit a sample, and algorithms compare it against every other sample in the database, looking for shared genetic sequences that indicate family relationships. For people with normal family histories, these results provide interesting confirmations of known relatives and occasionally surprising discoveries of cousins or distant connections. But the same technology that reunites families also has darker applications. It solves crimes, identifies Jane and John does, confirms paternity, and sometimes it exposes secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. John Damon's son had grown up with questions. The orphan story explained the absence of extended family on his father's side, but also meant missing pieces in his understanding of where he came from. When genetic testing became affordable and popular, submitting a sample must have seemed like a chance to fill in some of those blanks. He couldn't have known that the U.S. Marshals Service had also embraced genetic genealogy as an investigative tool. Cold cases involving fugitives might not have physical evidence like crime scene DNA, but family members still existed, still had DNA that could be collected and uploaded to databases, still represented potential avenues for identifying someone who disappeared. In Leslie Arnold's case, investigators had located his brother, Jimmy, who'd been 13 years old when he narrowly avoided being home the day their parents were murdered, who'd lived the rest of his life with the trauma of that day, who'd cooperated with authorities whenever asked. His DNA went into the system, a beacon waiting for someone genetically related to ping the database. The email notification arrived without fanfare. Just another automated message indicating a close family match in the Ancestry.com system. John Damon's son opened it, expecting perhaps to discover a previously unknown second cousin. What he found instead was a connection that made no sense given what he knew about his father's history. A close match. Close enough to indicate first-degree relationship, parent, child, or sibling. But his father was an orphan. No family, no siblings, no living relatives, except here was James Arnold of Nebraska, identified as a probable uncle. An uncle whose brother, Leslie Arnold, had been missing since 1967. An uncle who'd been working with U.S. Marshals to try to find that missing brother. The same alert appeared on the law enforcement side. Analysts reviewing genetic genealogy databases saw the match immediately, ran the probabilities, confirmed the relationships. After 55 years of silence, Leslie Arnold's family line had surfaced in the most unexpected way possible. But Leslie Arnold was dead. Had been since 2010, according to death records for John Damon. The man they'd been hunting had died 12 years earlier, peacefully and surrounded by family who had no idea who he really was. Imagine being the son in this scenario. Your entire understanding of your father's identity is about to shatter. The orphan from Chicago never existed. The man who raised you, taught you to be your best, shared his love of music and work ethic. That man was real, but his name wasn't. His childhood wasn't lost to foster care and fire. It ended when he murdered his parents at 16. The U.S. Marshals had to approach this carefully. They were about to tell someone that their deceased father was actually a fugitive killer who'd been living under an assumed identity for decades. That his grandmother and grandfather had been shot to death by the man who'd raised him. That his entire understanding of family history was built on lies that we don't know exactly how that conversation went, what words were chosen to cushion the blow, whether there was any way to soften information that devastating. But at some point, John Damon's son learned that John Damon had never legally existed, that the man in old photographs, the voice in memory, the father he'd mourned. That person was Leslie Arnold, teenage killer, prison escapee, one of the most successful fugitives in American history. When CNN reported the story, John Damon's son provided statement. It's worth considering in full because it captures something essential about the complexity of human identity and the ways we reconcile contradictory truths about people we love. There's no warning label on a DNA test telling you that you might not like what you find, he said, but I don't regret doing it. I'm glad I know the truth about my dad. That sentence alone contains multitudes. The acknowledgement that truth, however painful, matters more than comfortable fiction. The refusal to completely denounce the father he'd known, despite learning horrific things about his past, he continued. Yes, his life started with something awful, but that's not how I remember him. I remember the dad who worked hard, who loved music, who taught me to always be my best. That's the legacy he left me. 2 fathers and 1 man. Leslie Arnold, the 16-year-old who killed his parents over a girlfriend and car keys, then maintained a deception through 14 days that would have broken most people. And John Damon, the devoted father and hardworking businessman who built a life that seemed to contradict everything that came before. The statement carefully avoided judging the victims. The grandparents this man had never known he had, killed before he was born. It didn't minimize the murders or suggest they were justified. But it also didn't erase the reality of the relationship between father and son, the years of memory and experience that couldn't be retroactively undone by revealed truth. Other family members, siblings, stepfamily, the widow, chose to remain anonymous. Their pain was private. Their need to process this revelation away from public scrutiny, entirely understandable. The son who spoke to media became the spokesperson by default, navigating an impossible situation with a grace that suggested his father's advice about being your best had taken root. For the U.S. Marshals Service, the case could finally be marked solved. Leslie Arnold was confirmed dead. His location for the 43 years between escape and death was now known. The mystery that had frustrated investigators for more than half a century had an answer, even if that answer came too late for any form of justice. That doesn't redeem the murders. Doesn't make what happened to Bill and Opal Arnold any less tragic or unjust. But it does complicate the narrative in ways that resist easy moral conclusions. We want monsters to be monstrous in every aspect of their lives. Want clear lines between good and evil people. But life rarely cooperates with such tidy categorizations. Could Leslie Arnold have walked into a police station at any point after his escape and turned himself in? Of course. He chose not to, chose instead to maintain the deception, to keep running, to prioritize his freedom and his new identity over accountability for his crimes. That choice was selfish, illegal, and wrong. It showed contempt for justice, for the prison system that had incarcerated him, for his victim's memory. Whatever good he did as John Damon doesn't erase that fundamental selfishness. But in the decades since 1967, how many other men committed murder over equally trivial provocations? How many teenage killers served their time, were released, and immediately reoffended? How many violent criminals released from prison went on to hurt more people? John Damon hurt no one during his 43 years as a fugitive, built positive relationships, contributed to his community, raised children who spoke of him with obvious affection despite learning impossible truths about his past. This observation isn't meant to excuse his escape or minimize his original crimes, but it does raise uncomfortable questions about what justice means, what purpose incarceration serves, and whether rehabilitation can happen outside the formal systems designed to produce it. The case of Leslie Arnold/John Damon offers no easy answers. Just a reminder that human beings are more complicated than our categories for them. That time changes people in ways both profound and impossible to predict, and that sometimes the truth, when it finally emerges, creates more questions than it resolves. Somewhere in Australia, John Damon's family continues processing what they learned, reconciling the father they knew with the teenager who killed his parents, navigating the strange grief of mourning someone who was both more and less than they believed. And in Nebraska, the file on Leslie Arnold is finally closed, solved not through investigation or manhunt, but through the impersonal mathematics of genetic markers passed through generations. The cleanest escape in prison history ended not with recapture, but with revelation, decades after the fugitive had died, believing his secret would die with him. The lilac bush where he buried his parents is long gone. The house has likely been demolished or sold multiple times, its history a dark footnote that may or may not get disclosed to future owners. The Nebraska State Penitentiary has new fences, new protocols, new populations of inmates serving time for crimes committed in an era Leslie Arnold couldn't have imagined. But the questions persist. What does it mean to be a person? Can we truly change who we fundamentally are? Does the good we do later compensate for the evil we did before? And when someone lives two completely different lives, which one represents their true self? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the answer is that we're all performing versions of ourselves, constructing identities from available materials, becoming whoever we need to be to survive and build lives worth living. Leslie Arnold became John Damon so completely that even his children believe the fiction. And maybe, in some strange way, the fiction became real. Maybe John Damon was as authentic as Leslie Arnold, just built from different materials and motivated by different fears and desires. The truth, when DNA finally revealed it, didn't erase either man. It just showed that the distance between teenage killer and devoted father wasn't as vast as we'd like to believe. That transformation is possible, even if achieved through deception rather than formal rehabilitation. And that justice, however long delayed, eventually finds its way into the light, even if that light arrives 12 years too late to illuminate anything except memory.